What is the purpose of a research presentation? They're a way for researchers to get their work out there, spark new ideas and new potential collaborations. And when we're on the job hunt, they're a way to get our name out there and show off what a badass researcher we are. So when we present, we want to nail it and make sure we communicate what we're trying to communicate, and that no one who's been paying attention leaves confused or zones out because it's just too overwhelming. I'm Angela Nicholson, and today we're going to go over some of the principles of a solid research presentation. Before we start designing our talk, we need to think about the format of the talk and our audience. You will all be presenting for the Summer Research Conference. You'll have 10 minutes for a presentation over Zoom with a few minutes for questions. Your audience will be other people with similar interests to you, but they won't necessarily be a part of your subfield. So like we talked about before in our abstracts video, you'll want to avoid field-specific jargon. The number of slides in a 10-minute talk varies from person to person, but for me, that's about 10 to 12 slides. Let's take a look at how we can conceptualize structuring your talk. We start out by talking about the background. What does the audience need to know to understand your research? Start broadly by introducing your field and slowly narrow your focus until you come to your specific research question. State your question clearly. Then walk through all the research that you did. Talk about the specific sub-questions that you are interested in, how you tried to answer them, and talk about results if you have any, or what kind of results you were hoping to get. Finally, broaden your perspective briefly and talk about where this project could potentially go, or what kind of impact it could have on the field. Let's look at some practical examples. I'm going to show you actual slides from my first year in graduate school that I created before I had a strong grasp on how to put presentations together. Let's pretend I'm giving a talk with this slide. When mRNAs are produced, they are typically made with a poly-A tail. This tail can be removed by deadenylases, which can trigger further decay of the mRNA. What did you think about this slide? Did it help you understand what I was trying to say? Were you able to focus on what I was saying? It's really busy, right? There's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm not even talking about some of that stuff, so it doesn't seem to be important. It's easy to get lost, right? This brings us to our first principle of good presentations, Chekhovs Gun. Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright famous for his dramatic principle of, if there's a gun in Act 1, that gun needs to go off by Act 3. Or, if you show something that seems important to the audience, there needs to be some kind of payoff. This principle applies to your presentation as well. If you show something on a slide when you're presenting the background for your topic, you're making a promise to your audience that this thing you're talking about or showing is important. There needs to be some kind of payoff. It needs to be important to your talk. Otherwise, you're a dirty liar. So you need to trim your background down to just what your audience needs to know to understand your talk. So for my talk, we can get rid of all this garbage about the ribosome, these other processes that aren't important to what I'm trying to communicate, and the names of all these proteins that will never come up again. This slide that I used was a figure from a paper, and I understand the draw of wanting to use something from a paper. If you pull it from a paper, there's no chance of you showing something wrong. But unedited figures from papers aren't great for presentations. They're optimal for people who have the time to look over the figure at length and read from the paper. Your audience doesn't have that luxury. This brings us to our second principle. Simplify your slides as much as possible. Try to make your own figures if you can. No one expects you to be an amazing graphic designer, but you can use shapes just in PowerPoint to make simple figures that contain only the information you're trying to get across without all the extra stuff. Or use only the parts of a paper figure that you're going to talk about. If you don't talk about something, don't include it on your slides. There's no point, and it just adds something that could potentially confuse your audience and distract them. Let's take a look at what my slide might look like after I applied these first two principles. Here, I've just used simple shapes in PowerPoint to make my own figure that describes exactly what I need my audience to know, and nothing more. I've removed all the extraneous information and names of proteins that aren't directly relevant to my short talk. Now my audience can focus in on what I am specifically communicating for this slide. Here's another real-life slide that I once presented in my first year of grad school. Even if I were to start describing what this data means, how well do you think you would understand what I'm showing you? It's impossible to even see anything, right? And there's so much going on, it would be impossible to try to follow anything that I'm trying to say about it. Which brings us to tip 3. Make sure you use fonts and texts that your audience can read. Also, tip 4, only try to teach one concept per slide. There's too many things on this slide, and each one is a new concept that I'm trying to communicate. It's too much. If you're going to try to communicate something new, try to go on to a new slide or animate the graphics in as you talk about them. Lastly, the title on this slide isn't really helpful at all. Tip 5. When we title slides, we want them to be either a question that we want to pose or the punchline that we're trying to communicate, the conclusion of the data. So what does this slide look like when we take these tips into account? We have a nice title here that has the punchline of what I'm trying to say. We just have the one chart because we're only trying to communicate one concept. Without even going into how to interpret this chart, we can clearly see that these two conditions are different. After we set up how to interpret this graph, we can use animations to slowly add more information so that no one gets overwhelmed. All right, last example slide. This is a slide that goes near the end and talks about where I could potentially go with my project. It's a lot of words, right? There's really no way you could reasonably be expected to read all those words. And even if you did, you wouldn't be paying attention to what I'm saying. And the point is that this is a presentation, so you want the audience to pay attention to what you're actually saying. Tip 6. Get rid of as many words as possible. Take those words and slap them into your notes section. That way, when I present, I have those notes ready for me so I don't forget all the points I want to make. And instead of the text, include some graphical representations of what you're talking about and just say all those things that are in your notes. It makes it a lot easier for your audience to follow. So, a quick summary of all our tips. Number 1, be mindful of Chekhovs gun. Number 2, simplify your slides as much as possible. Number 3, use fonts that are readable. Number 4, teach one concept per slide. Number 5, give a descriptive title of the question you're posing or the point you're trying to make. Number 6, drop as many words as possible. You usually end with a quick acknowledgement slide to thank everyone in your lab, and then you should be ready to take questions. Nervous about questions? It's not a test, and you don't have to know the answer to everything. When in doubt, use these tried and true classics. That's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that. I'll definitely look into it. Or, oh, I wasn't aware of that. That's really interesting, though. I'm going to look into that later. Turns out there's no ending to this speech, and apparently that's the end. I wonder if Tim wrote more on the script and I didn't see it yet. If not, stay cool, researchers.